So 1 or 15, June 13th, 1943, the Bay of Biscay. Under a sliver of a moon, the dark, churning water offers a deceptive cloak of security. Kapitan Lieutenant Bodo Fiedler stands on the bridge of U-564, a Type 7C submarine, feeling the cold spray on his face as the boat clears the last defensive minefields off the coast of Brest. The massive concrete U-boat pens of the first U-boat flotilla, a seemingly impregnable fortress carved into the French coastline, are now just a silhouette against the occupied land. Below deck, the crew moves with practiced efficiency, the air thick with the smell of diesel fuel, preserved food, and nervous sweat. Their mission is straightforward, a transit that hundreds of crews have made before them. They must cross the approximately 400 nautical miles of the Bay of Biscay, a vast triangular body of water bordered by France and Spain, to reach the deep, open hunting grounds of the North Atlantic. The immediate stakes are survival. The operational state of U-564 is optimal. Its torpedoes are armed, its batteries fully charged from the shore power inside the bunker. The plan is simple: run on the surface at night to make best speed, using the diesel engines, and submerge during the day to avoid the sporadic Allied air patrols. This has been the standard procedure for years. It is a dangerous but manageable leg of the journey. Fiedler and his men feel the familiar tension, but it is tempered by a confidence born of experience and the formidable reputation of the U-boot Waffe. They are the hunters. They believe the bay is just a corridor, a dangerous but necessary path to their true battlefield. They do not know that the corridor is about to become a kill zone, that the very nature of their war has fundamentally and lethally changed in the weeks before they cast off. The strategic assumptions underpinning their mission are already obsolete. They are sailing into a meticulously prepared trap, a new kind of war where the hunters have become the hunted, right on their own doorstep. The darkness that feels like a shield is about to become an illuminated stage for their destruction. The Bay of Biscay would not be a transit zone. It would be a graveyard. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached a violent, pivotal turning point just weeks earlier, in May 1943. That month, forever seared into the Kriegsmarine's history as Black May, saw the U-boat force suffer unsustainable losses. 41 German submarines were sunk in a single month, a catastrophic number representing nearly a quarter of the entire operational fleet at the time. The sophisticated coordination of Allied convoy escorts, improved air cover, and new technologies had finally blunted the Wolfpack tactics that had brought Britain to the brink of starvation. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat campaign, and now Grand Admiral of the entire German Navy, faced a grim reality. The North Atlantic convoy routes, once a fertile hunting ground, had become a meat grinder. His crews were being lost at a rate far exceeding their ability to sink Allied shipping. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz made the difficult decision to temporarily withdraw most of his forces from the North Atlantic. The wolf packs were to be rested, refitted, and retrained, awaiting new weapons like the acoustic homing torpedo to regain their edge. This strategic pause, however, created a new problem. The U-boat fleet was not idle. Boats continued to sail from their French bases in Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, La Pallice, and Bordeaux. They were rerouted to what were considered softer targets, like the waters off Brazil or the coast of Africa. But to get there, every single one of them had to cross the Bay of Biscay. German doctrine held this transit as a calculated risk. The Luftwaffe was supposed to provide air cover from bases in western France, with long-range fighters like the Junkers Ju-88 flying protective patrols over the U-boats as they surfaced. The submarine's own METOX radar detectors were trusted to provide adequate warning of any approaching Allied aircraft using older radar systems, giving them enough time to perform a crash dive. The prevailing German belief was that the primary Allied anti-submarine effort was defensive, tethered to the convoys. The vast stretches of ocean between the bases and the convoys were thought to be too large to patrol effectively. This was a fatal miscalculation. The Allies, sensing a moment of weakness, were not content to simply wait for the U-boats to reappear on the convoy lanes. They had decided to take the fight to the enemy, to turn the U-boat's transit route into a lethal barrier. The Allied operational mindset was shifting from defense to offense, from reaction to aggression. They would not wait for the wolf to come to the flock. They would hunt the wolf in its own lair. The waters that Kapitän-Leutnant Fiedler and his crew were now entering were no longer a sparsely patrolled sea lane. They were the designated target area for a new, powerful, and coordinated Allied offensive. The entire strategic and tactical landscape of the bay had been redrawn, and the Germans were sailing directly into the heart of it, utterly unaware. The Allied response to the U-boat menace was not just a matter of more ships or more planes. It was a fundamental reorganization of assets into a new and deadly concept, the hunter-killer group. Before mid-1943, escort vessels were almost exclusively tied to convoys, forming a defensive screen around the vital merchant ships. Their job was to fend off attacks, to react. This was a strategy of attrition that, while necessary, ceded the initiative to the U-boats. The innovation was to untether these assets to create independent offensive units called support groups. These were not responsible for a specific convoy. Their sole mission was to actively hunt and destroy U-boats wherever they could be found. The most famous and feared of these was the Royal Navy's Second Support Group, commanded by the relentless and brilliant Captain Frederick John "Johnny" Walker. His flotilla was built around a core of 6 state-of-the-art Black Swan-class sloops, including his flagship, HMS Starling. These were not repurposed destroyers. They were purpose-built submarine killers. They were slower than destroyers, with a top speed of around 20 knots, a speed perfectly adequate for pursuing a submerged U-boat, which could rarely manage more than 7 knots underwater. What they lacked in top-end speed, they made up for in endurance and weaponry. They had a massive cruising range, allowing them to stay on patrol for extended periods. They were equipped with the latest Type 144 ASDIC, or sonar, for detecting submerged targets, and a fearsome array of anti-submarine weapons. This included a dense pattern of depth charges launched from rails at the stern and K-gun throwers on the sides, but also the new Hedgehog forward-throwing mortar. The Hedgehog fired a pattern of 24 small, contact-fused bombs ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at a set depth and relied on concussive force to damage the submarine's pressure hull, Hedgehog projectiles only exploded on impact. This meant an attack resulted in either a kill or a miss, with no ambiguous explosions to cloud the sonar picture. More importantly, it allowed the attacking ship to maintain sonar contact throughout the final moments of the attack, a critical advantage lost when a ship had to sail directly over a U-boat to drop conventional depth charges. Walker's group, and others like it, would not wait in the North Atlantic. Their new hunting ground was the Bay of Biscay. They would patrol the U-boat transit routes in overlapping patterns, creating a deep surface barrier that submarines would have to penetrate. They were a wolf pack of their own, designed to turn the tables on Dönitz's forces. Their very existence represented a doctrinal shift from guarding the sheep to exterminating the wolves. This surface component, deadly as it was, formed only one half of the new Allied strategy. The other half operated in the skies above. The second pillar of the Allied Biscay offensive was a dramatic expansion of long-range air power, specifically deployed by Royal Air Force Coastal Command. For years, air patrols had been limited by range. Aircraft like the short Sunderland flying boat were effective but could not cover the vast mid-Atlantic gap. The U-boats had learned to exploit these coverage limits, surfacing with impunity in areas beyond the reach of land-based aircraft. This changed decisively with the arrival in force of the American-built B-24 Liberator bomber, adapted for maritime patrol. The VLR, or Very Long Range, Liberator was a war-winning weapon. With extra fuel tanks fitted in its bomb bay, it could patrol for up to 16 hours, flying a massive looping search pattern of over 2,000 miles. A squadron of VLR Liberators operating from bases in Cornwall, England, and Northern Ireland could effectively seal the entire Bay of Biscay. Day and night, these aircraft flew what were termed air barrier patrols, creating an inescapable net of aerial surveillance. The true innovation, however, was not just the aircraft itself, but what was inside it. By the summer of 1943, these Liberators and Sunderlands were equipped with the new ASV Mark III centimetric radar. Operating on a 10-centimeter wavelength, it was a generational leap beyond the older 1.5-meter wavelength radars. The critical advantage of this new system was that it was undetectable by the METOX radar warning receivers fitted to every German U-boat. German crews had come to rely on the telltale buzz of their METOX sets to warn them of an approaching aircraft, giving them a window of several minutes to crash dive. They felt safe on the surface as long as the METOX was silent. But against the ASV Mark III, the METOX was useless. The Allied aircraft was completely invisible to the U-boat's electronic senses. An RAF crew could now detect the tiny blip of a surfaced U-boat from miles away, descend through cloud cover, and be in the final stage of their attack run before the lookouts on the submarine's bridge could even see or hear them. The first warning a U-boat crew would have of an attack was often the scream of diving engines or the explosion of 250-pound depth bombs bracketing their vessel. This technological asymmetry was devastating. It turned the U-boat's primary survival tactic, surfacing at night to recharge batteries and make good speed, into a death trap. The darkness was no longer a sanctuary. The sky was no longer empty. For the U-boats, the entire operational environment of the bay had been poisoned by an invisible, undetectable threat that stalked them from above, ready to strike without warning. The Allied trap was now set, a coordinated system of sea and air power, waiting for its prey. The initial encounters in June 1943 were a brutal shock to the German U-boat crews. They left their fortified pens in France with the ingrained belief that the greatest danger lay far out in the Atlantic, near the convoys. The transit across the bay was seen as a routine, if tense, preliminary. That illusion was shattered with sudden, lethal violence. On June 14th, the day after leaving Brest, Captain Lieutenant Bodo Fiedler's U-564 was running on the surface when it was spotted by an Australian-crewed Sunderland flying boat from No. 10 Squadron RAAF. The attack was swift. The lumbering flying boat dove, its machine guns strafing the conning tower as it released a stick of depth charges. Fiedler was killed on the bridge. The U-boat, heavily damaged and unable to dive, was crippled. Another Sunderland arrived, and then a Whitley bomber. They circled the wounded submarine, attacking with depth, charges, and machine gun fire for hours. The surviving crew eventually abandoned the boat, which sank stern first into the bay. It had been destroyed less than 24 hours into its patrol. This was not an isolated incident. The pattern repeated itself across the bay. U-boats surfacing to recharge their batteries, their crews confident in their silent METOX receivers, were suddenly illuminated by powerful Lee light searchlights mounted under the wings of patrolling Liberators, or ambushed in broad daylight by aircraft appearing as if from nowhere. On June 24th, U-119 and U-449 were transiting the bay together. They were spotted by aircraft, which then vectored in Captain Walker's second support group. HMS Starling, Wild Goose, Wren, and Woodpecker closed in. U-119 was rammed and sunk by Starling. U-449 was forced to dive and then relentlessly hunted with sonar. After a sustained series of depth charge attacks that blew out its lights and ruptured its hull, the U-boat was forced to the surface, where it was shelled and sunk. The German crews were caught in an impossible dilemma. Staying on the surface invited sudden attack from the air. Diving to escape the aircraft made them vulnerable to the waiting surface escorts. Their established pattern of transit, surface at night, dive during the day, was completely broken. Post-war analysis of U-boat logs from this period reveals a recurring theme of confusion and fear. Commanders reported being attacked without any warning from their electronic equipment. They could not understand how they were being found with such precision in the vastness of the ocean. The psychological impact was immense. The one place they had felt relatively safe, the transit lane near home, had overnight become the most dangerous stretch of water in the world. The Allied offensive in the Bay of Biscay was defined by its seamless coordination between air and surface forces, a symphony of destruction orchestrated by RAF Coastal Command and the Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command. The two arms of the Allied military worked not in parallel, but as a single integrated killing machine. The process was brutally effective. A VLR Liberator on a sweeping patrol pattern would pick up a contact on its ASV Mark III radar, a tiny spark on the cathode ray tube, indicating a surfaced U-boat, often more than 20 nautical miles away. The pilot would descend towards the target, using cloud cover for concealment whenever possible. The U-boat, its METOX receiver silent, remained oblivious. The aircraft's first attack was designed not just to sink the U-boat, but also to pin it down. A well-placed string of depth charges could force the submarine into a crash dive, potentially causing damage that would slow its underwater speed or leave a trail of leaking oil. The primary objective was to strip the U-boat of its greatest asset, its mobility on the surface. Once the U-boat was submerged, the hunt changed character. The aircraft could not attack it directly, but it was not powerless. The pilot would immediately transmit the U-boat's last known position, course, and speed to shore command. This information was then relayed to the nearest support group on patrol. Captain Walker's sloops, or another hunter-killer group, would alter course at best speed to intercept. The aircraft would remain on station, circling the area, dropping sea markers or smoke floats to guide the surface ships in. For the U-boat crew, the moments after a crash dive were terrifying. They were blind, running on electric motors that drained their precious battery life. Every minute spent submerged brought them closer to being forced to surface again. Above them, they could hear the drone of the aircraft's engines, a constant reminder that they were being watched. Then a new sound would appear, a sound that chilled the blood of even the most veteran submariner, the rhythmic metallic ping of active sonar searching for them. This was the sound of the surface hunters arriving. Walker's group practiced a highly refined tactic known as the creeping attack. Instead of a high-speed depth charge run that would cause the attacking ship to lose sonar contact at the last moment, two ships would work together. One, the directing ship, would stand off, holding the U-boat in its sonar beam and instructing the second, the attacking ship, via radio. The attacking ship would approach slowly, its own engines making minimal noise, and drop a devastating pattern of depth charges with lethal precision. Inside the U-boat, the experience was hellish. The hull would groan and creak under the immense pressure of the explosions, lights would shatter, pipes would burst, and gauges would fail. The air would grow foul as the depth charges detonated closer and closer, each explosion a hammer blow against the hull. The psychological toll of being trapped in a dark steel tube, hunted by an unseen and inescapable enemy, was immense. This coordinated tactic of air-to-sea handover ensured that once a U-boat was found, it rarely escaped. The aircraft drove them down, and the ships kept them down until their air and batteries were exhausted or their hull was breached. The bay had become a layered trap with no safe place to hide. Faced with mounting losses and the complete failure of their existing tactics, the German U-Boat Command, BDU, desperately sought a countermeasure. Admiral Dönitz, a man who had built his career on offensive innovation, was now forced into a reactive, defensive posture. His first response was technological. If the U-boats were being attacked on the surface, they needed to be able to fight back. The order was given to upgun the submarines. The single 20mm anti-aircraft gun on the conning tower was supplemented or replaced with heavier armaments, typically a flak Vierling, a quadruple-barreled 20mm cannon mount that could put up a formidable wall of fire. Some boats were even fitted with a 37mm cannon. The second response was tactical. If a single U-boat was vulnerable, perhaps a group of them would be stronger. Dönitz ordered the U-boats to transit the bay in groups. On the surface, in broad daylight. The theory was that their combined anti-aircraft firepower could fend off attacking aircraft. They were ordered to stay on the surface and fight it out. This decision, born of desperation, would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. On July 12, 1943, a Sunderland from No. 228 Squadron RAF attacked the U-tanker U-487. The U-boat fought back fiercely with its new guns, damaging the aircraft. But the Sunderland pressed its attack and sank the submarine. Over the next few weeks, the Bay of Biscay witnessed a series of brutal, open battles between aircraft and U-boats. In some early encounters, the Germans did manage to shoot down their attackers. An RAF Halifax bomber was shot down on July 30th while attacking a group of 3 U-boats, but the Allies adapted with ruthless speed. Instead of sending single aircraft, they began to coordinate multi-aircraft attacks. A Liberator might make the initial contact and then call in reinforcements, such as rocket-firing Beaufighter heavy fighters or Mosquito fighter bombers. These faster, more agile aircraft could strafe the U-boats' gun crews, suppressing their fire while the larger bombers made their depth charge runs. The German tactic of grouping together on the surface simply made the submarines larger, more visible targets. A cluster of U-boats created a much bigger radar signature and presented a more lucrative target for a coordinated strike. The attempt to turn the U-boats into anti-aircraft platforms failed utterly. It went against the very nature of a submarine, which relies on stealth, not firepower, for its survival. By forcing his crews to fight a surface action against superior air power, Dönitz was condemning many of them to death. The losses continued to mount, each one a testament to a failed countermeasure. The Battle of the Bay was not just a series of isolated actions. It was a sustained, systematic campaign that transformed a 300,000-square-mile body of water into a lethal bottleneck. By late July and early August 1943, the Allied strategy had reached its peak effectiveness, and the Bay of Biscay had become a veritable killing ground for the U-boot Waffe. The combined pressure from constant air patrols and lurking surface support groups made the transit an almost suicidal endeavor. For a U-boat crew leaving Lorient or Saint-Nazaire, the journey out was a terrifying gauntlet. The map in words of their transit traces a path of escalating danger. They would navigate the heavily mined coastal channels, often escorted by German minesweepers or patrol boats for the first few miles. But once they reached the open waters of the bay, they were on their own. Their route would typically be a southwesterly track, aiming to cross the relatively shallow continental shelf as quickly as possible to reach the deep water where they could dive to greater, safer depths. It was precisely this transit lane that the Allies targeted. RAF Coastal Command's patrol boxes were laid out to cover this route in its entirety. The hunter-killer groups under commanders like Johnny Walker patrolled the western edge of the bay, forming a final barrier. A U-boat commander had to contend with the constant threat of a surprise attack from a Liberator or Sunderland whose centimetric radar gave no warning. If they detected a plane and crash-dived, they risked running into a surface group. The period from July 30th to August 2nd, 1943, was particularly grim for the Kriegsmarine. In what became known as the Massacre of the Biscay U-boats, Allied forces, primarily aircraft, mounted a relentless offensive against the U-boats now traveling in groups on the surface. U-461, U-462, and U-504 were all sunk in a single massive air-sea battle on July 30th. Over the next 2 days, several more were sunk or severely damaged. The statistics from this period are stark. In the 3 months from June to August 1943, over 24 U-boats were sunk in the Bay of Biscay transit area. This was a loss rate that was completely unsustainable. These were not losses incurred during attacks on convoys, where the risk was expected. These were losses suffered before the U-boats could even begin their operational patrols, before they had a chance to fire a single torpedo. The bay, once a mere extension of their secure bases, was now the most dangerous place on Earth for a German submariner. The strategic impact of the Bay of Biscay campaign was profound and immediate, sending shockwaves through the entire German naval command. The losses sustained between June and August 1943 crippled the U-boat arm at a moment when it was already reeling from the disaster of Black May. The most damaging consequence was the loss of experienced crews and, crucially, veteran commanders. A U-boat was a complex weapon, and its effectiveness depended almost entirely on the skill and nerve of its captain. These men, many of them decorated aces, were an irreplaceable asset. When they were lost, they took with them thousands of hours of combat experience. The new commanders who replaced them were younger, less experienced, and were being sent into a combat environment that was exponentially more hostile than the one their predecessors had faced. Their chances of survival were grim. The campaign effectively established an Allied blockade of the German submarine bases on the French coast. The ability of Dönitz to deploy his forces into the Atlantic was severely compromised. For every 10 boats that set out, a significant percentage, at times as high as 25% according to some post-war studies, would not make it past the bay. This dramatically reduced the number of U-boats that could be brought to bear against the convoys. The tonnage war, which was the entire strategic purpose of the U-boat campaign, faltered. The Allies were now sinking U-boats faster than German shipyards could build them, and killing crews faster than they could be trained. This attrition had a cascading effect on German morale. U-boat crews, once considered the elite of the Kriegsmarine, began to understand that their missions were becoming increasingly suicidal. The promise of new technologies like the Type 21 electro boot was still far in the future. They were being forced to fight with weapons and tactics that were obsolete against an enemy that held every technological and numerical advantage. By the end of August 1943, Dönitz had no choice but to concede defeat in the bay. He rescinded the order to fight on the surface and instructed his U-boats to take a new, much longer route, hugging the coast of Spain in shallow waters where sonar was less effective. This added days to their transit time, consumed precious fuel, and further reduced their time on station in the Atlantic. The battle for the bay was over. The Allies had won total control of the transit routes, a victory that would ensure the sea lanes to Britain remained open for the build-up to D-Day. The Bay of Biscay campaign of summer 1943 marked the final, irreversible turning of the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boat, which had begun the war as the supreme predator of the seas, a silent hunter that held the fate of nations in its grasp, was now definitively the hunted. The strategy of the hunter-killer group, seamlessly integrating the reach of long-range aircraft with the staying power of surface warships, had shattered the foundations of German submarine warfare. The German belief in their technological edge, symbolized by the Me-Tox receiver, was proven to be a fatal illusion. Their tactical doctrine, from lone wolf attacks to coordinated wolf packs, was rendered obsolete by a foe who chose not to defend, but to attack. The psychological dominance the U-boat crews once felt was replaced by a gnawing fear, the knowledge that even in the waters just miles from their fortified homes, they were no longer safe. The campaign demonstrated a new paradigm of anti-submarine warfare, one based on offensive, proactive operations that sought to destroy the enemy's capacity to fight before it could even be brought to bear. This shift from static defense to aggressive pursuit would define Allied naval strategy for the remainder of the war and beyond. The graves of dozens of U-boats and thousands of German sailors at the bottom of the Bay of Biscay stand as a sober testament to this pivotal moment, when the wolf of the Atlantic was finally trapped and broken in its own backyard.